China didn't retaliate. It didn't even speak. It simply made one quiet move. And the US economy began to break. In geopolitics, power isn't always loud. Sometimes the most devastating move is made quietly. That's exactly what China did. In 2025, Beijing didn't issue a warning. It didn't send a delegate. It didn't even raise its voice. It simply updated its export data. And in that quiet action, slashed rare earth magnet exports by 58%. It didn't make global headlines, but in Detroit, Seattle, Dallas, and Silicon Valley, factories dimmed their lights, assembly lines paused, executive phones lit up with crisis calls. In just 72 hours, US manufacturing had begun to crack. Not because of sanctions, not because of war, because of a chokehold on minerals most people have never heard of, but that every modern device depends on. Rare earths, the backbone of electric vehicles, smartphones, military systems, and advanced technology, and China controls nearly all of it. Yet even as this economic tsunami hit, Donald Trump faced cameras with that familiar mix of bravado and optimism. "We've had a very good talk," he said. "They'll be calling soon." Only they weren't. There was no back-channel communication, no negotiation underway, no diplomatic response at all. Just silence. And that silence was strategic. Trump wasn't delivering facts. He was delivering hope, wrapped in performance. In Washington, optics often replace planning. In that moment, Trump wasn't leading. He was acting. China hadn't retaliated. It had executed. A single, deeply calculated export restriction had disrupted America's industrial base from defense to consumer tech, without a single shot fired. Trump's words, "They'll be calling soon," were never a projection of power. They were a plea disguised as confidence. A strategy built for the stock market, not the factory floor. Because in the real world, leverage requires communication, and Beijing had gone dark, not out of fear, but out of confidence, because China didn't need to respond. They had already made their move. Here's what made it worse. The US had known about its rare earth dependency for years. Reports, warnings, studies, all acknowledged the strategic vulnerability. But when it came time to prepare, Washington bet on narrative, China bet on infrastructure. And when it mattered, only one side had options. As US factories slowed and suppliers panicked, China didn't escalate. It didn't make threats. It waited. Because patience, backed by control of essential resources, is more powerful than any speech. And this was no ordinary retaliation. This was a surgical strike. It wasn't aimed at votes. It was aimed at vulnerability. Meanwhile, the US response became surreal. While suppliers sounded the alarm and industries scrambled to source non-existent alternatives, the president doubled down on the show. He praised Xi Jinping, called him tough and smart, tried to frame him as a worthy adversary, because that allowed Trump to frame himself as the only man capable of handling him. But that wasn't diplomacy. That was narrative positioning, an old political trick. Elevate your enemy so even a stalemate looks like victory. The truth? There was no deal. There was no negotiation. There was no leverage. Just a camera, a microphone, and a leader trying to project strength in the face of quiet devastation. As rare earth restrictions rattled American industry, Trump's trade war narrative began to fall apart. His core promise that tariffs would force China to the negotiating table had failed. Beijing wasn't at the table. Beijing had built its own. So Washington escalated again. The battlefield shifted from raw materials to something far more strategic: technology. New export controls were introduced. AI chips, semiconductor manufacturing tools, quantum computing hardware. The message was clear. The US would now try to choke China's tech advancement. But just like the rare earth gambit, the blowback was immediate. American companies, not Chinese ones, were the first to feel the pain. Major chip designers, software giants, and equipment makers warned of billions in lost contracts. They weren't just losing sales, they were losing global trust. Foreign customers saw American firms not as partners, but as tools of Washington's foreign policy. And unlike rare earths, where China held the supply chain, tech was globally interwoven. Disruptions here weren't surgical, they were systemic. By trying to stall Beijing's rise, Washington had triggered a global realignment, one where the cost was paid in US jobs, contracts, and investment. What began as economic pressure quickly turned into supply chain collapse. All while Beijing didn't flinch. The illusion of leverage. At rallies and press briefings, Trump kept repeating the same line. "We've taken in hundreds of billions of dollars from China." It sounded like victory. It wasn't, because tariffs are taxes on imports, and those taxes aren't paid by China. They're paid by American companies, retailers, and consumers. That hundreds of billions didn't come from Beijing. It came from US wallets, electronics, farm equipment, machinery. Prices rose across the board. Margins shrank. Layoffs happened. Factories paused investment. The administration pointed to a reduced trade deficit. But that drop came not from winning, but from shrinking. Less trade, less output, less global integration. This wasn't strategic gain. It was economic contraction. Yet the illusion held, because the headlines kept pace with the performance. The London talks, diplomacy, or theatre. By the time US and Chinese negotiators met in London, the damage was done. Rare earths had been cut. Tech supply chains were in chaos. American companies were bleeding. And still, no agreement, no progress on critical minerals, no reversal on export controls, no market access reform, just a carefully worded joint statement. Constructive, they called it, but behind the scenes, nothing had changed. There was no resolution. There wasn't even movement. Only a desire from Washington to manufacture an image of control. Trump needed a headline, not a breakthrough, and that's exactly what the London Declaration delivered. A press quote, not a policy shift. Inside the room, negotiators weren't strategizing victory, they were staging optics, because that's how modern diplomacy often works. When you can't solve the problem, perform over it. The collapse of strategy. What was supposed to be a historic reset, a bold US strategy to rebalance global trade, had devolved into a slow-motion stall. China didn't crumble. It pivoted. Trump didn't dominate. He got trapped. Every move made to appear strong was met by a more patient, more precise, more silent Chinese response. The US clung to the microphone. China rewired the system. And the longer the war dragged on, the more visible the truth became. America had lost leverage. Its supply chains were exposed. Its firms were fragmented. Its economy had taxed itself to prove a point that never landed. What began as confrontation ended in fragmentation, not because of Chinese aggression, but because of Chinese discipline. Final thought. The most dangerous kind of failure is the one that looks like victory until the bill comes due. The rare earth export cut was just one move, but it exposed everything, not just strategic vulnerability, but narrative dependence, not just industrial fragility, but political performance. Trump promised control. What he delivered was a stage. And on that stage, while Washington delivered sound bites, Beijing delivered silence. A silence that didn't just speak louder, it won.